Some people say that true character reveals itself at 30,000 feet. On this particular first-class flight from Los Angeles to New York, that truth was about to be demonstrated in a way that none of the passengers would ever forget. If you're watching this from anywhere around the world, drop a comment to let us know where you're viewing from. Because this story of humility and respect is one that transcends all borders. The first-class cabin of Flight AA-2471 hummed with the quiet efficiency that only premium air travel can provide. The subtle fragrance of hand-warmed towels and freshly brewed coffee mingled with the unmistakable scent of privilege. It was in this rarefied air that Marcus Sterling, CEO of a rising tech company, settled into his seat 2A with the practiced ease of someone who considered first class his natural habitat. Dressed in a tailored Brioni suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, Marcus had perfected the art of making his presence felt without saying a word. His Rolex Daytona glinted under the cabin lights as he adjusted his vintage cufflinks, a ritual he performed partly out of habit and partly to ensure that others noticed the careful curation of his success. The pre-flight routine was proceeding as usual until a large figure appeared in the aisle. Dressed in comfortable athletic wear, a fitted black t-shirt, dark joggers, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, the man moved with a quiet confidence that seemed at odds with the luxury surrounding him. A small silver chain hung around his neck, and a simple leather bag was slung over his shoulder. Marcus Sterling's perfectly manicured eyebrows lifted slightly as he watched the casually dressed man check his boarding pass for seat 2B right next to him. The tech executive's lips curled into a barely concealed smirk as he took in his seatmate's attire, which, while clean and well-kept, was a far cry from the usual first-class dress code. Lisa Reynolds, the senior flight attendant with 20 years of experience, approached with a warm smile, her recognition carefully concealed behind years of professional discretion. She knew exactly who had just taken seat 2B, but she also knew that some passengers preferred their privacy. Behind her, flight attendant David Chen was already preparing the pre-flight champagne service, though his hands trembled slightly as he realized whose glass he would be filling. At the back of the first-class cabin, Amanda Torres, another crew member, whispered something to her colleague while stealing glances at seat 2B. As the casual-clad passenger settled into his seat, an 8-year-old boy named Peter, traveling with his mother in seat 4C, tugged urgently at her sleeve, his eyes wide with recognition. His mother, Mrs. Catherine Walsh, quickly shushed him, though she too had realized who was sharing their cabin. Marcus Sterling, however, remained oblivious to the quiet ripple of recognition moving through the first-class cabin. Instead, he focused on what he perceived as an affront to the unwritten rules of premium air travel. Here was someone who clearly didn't understand the proper etiquette of first class, or so he thought. The cabin continued to fill as Bradley Thompson, a retired military veteran in seat 3C, watched the situation unfold with quiet interest. His years of service had taught him to read people, and he could sense the brewing tension between the two men in row 2. Captain Richard Anderson's voice crackled over the intercom, welcoming passengers aboard, though there was an unusual enthusiasm in his tone that the regular first-class travelers didn't quite understand. In the galley, the flight crew exchanged knowing looks, already anticipating how this flight might unfold. Marcus Sterling's irritation grew as his seatmate politely declined the offered champagne, requesting water instead. This seemed to confirm Sterling's suspicions about his seatmate's belonging, or lack thereof, in first class. The tech executive shifted in his leather seat, making sure his Hermes tie was perfectly centered before he decided to address what he saw as an anomaly in his carefully curated world. Little did Marcus Sterling know that his next words would soon make him wish he'd never opened his mouth. The man beside him was none other than Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, though the baseball cap and his humble demeanor had somehow escaped Sterling's recognition. The former WWE champion and current Hollywood megastar was about to teach everyone on Flight AA-2471 a lesson about judgment, respect, and true class that would resonate far beyond their first-class cabin. As the remaining passengers settled in, Flight attendant Lisa Reynolds continued her pre-flight preparations, occasionally glancing at row 2 with a mixture of anticipation and concern. She had seen her share of first-class drama over the years, but something told her this flight would be different. Young Peter Walsh was practically bouncing in his seat now, his excitement barely contained as he whispered to his mother, "Mom, that's really him." Mrs. Walsh tried to maintain her composure, though she too was amazed at their famous fellow passenger's humble demeanor. The contrast between the two men in row 2 couldn't have been more striking. Marcus Sterling, with his carefully calculated appearance and obvious display of wealth, seemed to take up more space than his seat allowed, his presence demanding attention. Besides him, Dwayne Johnson, despite his impressive physical stature, carried himself with a quiet dignity that somehow made him blend in, despite being one of the most recognizable celebrities in the world. Bradley Thompson, watching from his seat, was reminded of his days in the service, where he'd learned that true leadership never needed to announce itself. He settled back, anticipating that this flight might offer a master class in that very principle. As the last passengers found their seats, Marcus Sterling's patience with his casually dressed seatmate finally ran out. The tech executive had built his career on being direct, on maintaining certain standards, and on never apologizing for expecting excellence. In his mind, he was about to do everyone in first class a favor by addressing what he saw as an obvious mistake. The cabin air seemed to thicken with tension as Marcus Sterling cleared his throat, adjusted his expensive tie one final time, and turned to address the man beside him. The other first-class passengers, already aware of who was sitting in 2B, held their collective breath. Flight attendant Lisa Reynolds paused in the galley, her years of experience telling her to stay close. Little did Marcus Sterling know that his next words would not only reveal his own prejudices, but would also set in motion a series of events that would leave him wishing he'd chosen a different flight, a different seat, or at least a different attitude. The lesson he was about to learn about humility, respect, and true class would cost him nothing in dollars but everything in pride. As the engines began their pre-flight warm-up, creating a gentle vibration throughout the cabin, Marcus Sterling opened his mouth to speak, completely unaware that he was about to commit what the internet would soon dub the first-class faux pas of the year. The other passengers, the flight crew, and even young Peter Walsh fell silent, knowing they were about to witness something extraordinary. This was more than just another first-class flight from Los Angeles to New York. It was about to become a story of assumption and reality, of appearance and truth, of arrogance and humility. As Marcus Sterling prepared to speak, no one in the cabin could have predicted exactly how this encounter would unfold, but everyone who witnessed it would remember it for years to come. The lesson about to be taught at 30,000 feet would prove that true class has nothing to do with the seat you occupy, the clothes you wear, or the watch on your wrist. It has everything to do with how you treat others, especially when you think no one of consequence is watching. For Marcus Sterling, this lesson was about to be delivered by someone who embodied that truth in every way. Even if Sterling couldn't see it yet, Marcus Sterling had built his empire on being able to read a room, on knowing exactly who was who in any given situation. But as he turned to address his seatmate, he was about to make the kind of mistake that no amount of money or status could easily recover from. "You know," Sterling began, his voice carrying that particular tone of condescension that only comes from years of believing in one's own superiority, "first class has certain standards." He adjusted his Brioni suit jacket, letting his Rolex catch the light once more. "It's not just about having the money for the ticket. It's about understanding the environment." Dwayne Johnson turned slightly in his seat, his expression neutral but attentive. Around them, the first-class cabin had grown eerily quiet. Lisa Reynolds, the senior flight attendant, paused in the aisle, her practiced smile masking her disbelief at what was unfolding. Sterling, mistaking the silence for tacit approval, continued his unsolicited lecture. "I mean, look around you." He gestured to the other passengers. most of whom were now trying their best to appear deeply engrossed in their pre-flight routines. There's a certain expectation, a dress code, if you will. Not everyone understands that, of course. Bradley Thompson, the retired veteran in 3C, gripped his armrest a little tighter, years of military discipline keeping him from intervening. Young Peter Walsh whispered urgently to his mother, "Mom, why is that mean man talking to the rock like that?" But Catherine quickly shushed him, though her own expression showed growing discomfort. The rock remained calm, his response measured and quiet. "Thank you for your concern about the standards," he said, his voice carrying that distinctive warm bass tone that had become famous worldwide, though Sterling somehow remained oblivious to its recognition. "I appreciate you looking out for the environment up here." Sterling, completely missing the subtle hints from other passengers and the flight crew, took this response as encouragement. "Exactly. I'm glad you understand. You see, some people just don't belong in certain places. It's not elitism. It's about maintaining standards. I've worked hard to be here, and I expect a certain level of sophistication from my fellow passengers." David Chen, the flight attendant, nearly dropped the bottle of champagne he was holding. Amanda Torres quickly steadied him, both watching the scene with a mixture of horror and fascination. In the cockpit, word had already reached Captain Richard Anderson about the situation developing in first class. "Hard work is definitely important," the rock agreed, his massive shoulders relaxed despite Sterling's continuing condescension. "It's what builds character, shapes who we are. Would you say that's been your experience?" Sterling puffed up at what he perceived as submission to his worldview. "Absolutely. I'm glad you're beginning to understand. I'm Marcus Sterling, CEO of Sterling Tech Solutions. Perhaps you've heard of it?" He reached into his jacket, producing a business card with a flourish. "We're revolutionizing the tech industry. When people see me walk into a room, they know exactly who I am and what I represent." The irony of his statement hung in the air like the overhead oxygen masks none of the passengers hoped they'd need to use. Lisa Reynolds bit her lip to keep from laughing, while Bradley Thompson shook his head slowly, recognizing the textbook example of pride before a fall. "That's interesting," the rock responded, his voice carrying genuine curiosity. "So you believe appearance is the best measure of success? Of belonging?" Sterling, still riding high on his perceived superiority, missed the subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere. "Of course. Look at me. This suit, this watch, this lifestyle. It's about presenting yourself in a way that commands respect. Something that, forgive me for saying, you might want to consider. I mean, athletic wear in first class? Come on." Young Peter could barely contain himself now, tugging at his mother's sleeve with increasing urgency. Catherine Walsh was torn between embarrassment for Sterling and amazement at the rock's composed handling of the situation. "Respect is an interesting concept," the rock mused, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had earned it both in and out of the ring. "Would you say it's something that should be given based on appearance or earned through actions?" Sterling laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that made several passengers wince. "In my world, appearance is action. When I walk into a boardroom, people know exactly who's in charge. It's about power, presence, projection of success." He gestured at the rock's attire once more. "Not everyone understands that clearly." Lisa Reynolds had moved closer to their row, ostensibly checking the overhead compartments, but actually ready to intervene if needed. She caught the rock's eye briefly, and he gave her a subtle nod that everything was under control. "Success can be measured in many ways," the rock responded, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Sterling's growing agitation. "Some counted in dollars, others in lives touched. What would you say is your most meaningful measure of success?" Sterling, still completely unaware of who he was lecturing, launched into another self-aggrandizing speech. "My company's valuation just hit $10 billion. I have homes in 4 countries. My car collection alone is worth more than most people make in a lifetime. That's real success. Tangible, measurable, visible success." The other passengers had given up any pretense of not listening. Bradley Thompson had turned in his seat to watch directly, his military bearing forgotten in the face of this unprecedented display of hubris. Amanda Torres and David Chen had positioned themselves at opposite ends of the first-class cabin, both recording mental notes for what would surely become legend among flight crew stories. "You know," The Rock said, his voice carrying a hint of amusement now, "I once thought similar things about success. Back in my early days, when I had $7 in my pocket and dreams of making it big, it's funny how perspective changes over time." Sterling, still riding his wave of assumed superiority, scoffed. $7? Please. Some of us were born for success. We understand the game, the image, the importance of never appearing common. He practically spat the last word, his disdain evident. The cabin pressure seemed to shift, though the aircraft hadn't yet taken off. Lisa Reynolds checked her watch, knowing the pre-flight announcements would soon begin. She almost wished they could delay them, sensing that Sterling's moment of realization was imminent. Young Peter Walsh could no longer contain himself. Just as Sterling opened his mouth to continue his lecture on success and status, the boy's voice rang out across the first-class cabin. "Mom, should we tell the mean man that he's talking to The Rock?" The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ambient noise of the aircraft seemed to pause as Sterling's expression froze mid-sentence. Slowly, very slowly, he turned to look at his seatmate again, this time really seeing him for the first time. The Rock's smile was gentle but unmistakable now. "Nice to meet you, Marcus. Dwayne Johnson." He extended his hand. "But you might know me better as The Rock." The color drained from Sterling's face so quickly that Lisa Reynolds actually took a step forward, concerned he might faint. The tech CEO's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words emerged. His Rolex-adorned hand trembled slightly as the full impact of his behavior began to sink in. Around them, the first-class cabin held its collective breath, watching as Marcus Sterling's carefully constructed world of status and appearance crumbled in the face of true success. The kind that didn't need designer suits or expensive watches to command respect. The pre-flight announcements were about to begin, but this story was far from over. Marcus Sterling was about to learn that true class has nothing to do with the clothes you wear or the seat you occupy, a lesson that would continue at 30,000 feet. The pre-flight announcements began to play through the cabin speakers, but no one in first class was paying attention. Marcus Sterling sat frozen in his seat, his earlier bravado replaced by a pallor that made his expensive silk tie look garish against his now ashen face. The reality of his situation was sinking in with each passing second. He had just spent the last several minutes lecturing one of the world's most successful entertainers about status and appearance. The Rock's response to Sterling's evident distress demonstrated exactly why he was known as much for his character as his success. "Hey, don't worry about it," he said, his voice carrying that characteristic warmth that had endeared him to millions. "Let's start over. Sometimes our first impressions aren't our best ones." Lisa Reynolds approached with a fresh round of water for both men, her professional demeanor masking her satisfaction at witnessing this moment of humbling. Sterling's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the water, nearly spilling it on his $12,000 suit. I didn't," Sterling stammered, his carefully cultivated executive presence deserting him entirely. "Mr. Johnson, I am so incredibly sorry. I had no idea." His voice trailed off as he realized that this admission only made his previous behavior worse. "That's actually an interesting point," The Rock responded, turning slightly in his seat to face Sterling directly. "Would it make my worth as a person any different if I wasn't who I am? Does the measure of someone's right to respect change based on their fame or recognition?" Bradley Thompson, the retired veteran, nodded appreciatively from his seat. He'd seen this kind of teaching moment before, when someone of true authority uses their position not to humiliate, but to educate. Young Peter Walsh was practically vibrating with excitement in his seat, watching his hero handle the situation with the same grace he brought to his performances. His mother, Catherine, was equally impressed, though for different reasons. She was witnessing a master class in turning conflict into conversation. The aircraft began its taxi to the runway, but the drama in first class was far from over. Sterling, attempting to recover some semblance of dignity, tried to backtrack. "Of course not, Mr. Johnson. I was completely out of line. If I had known who you were—" "But that's exactly what we need to talk about," The Rock interrupted gently. "The 'if I had known who you were' part. Because here's the thing. Every person on this plane, in this world, deserves the same basic respect, regardless of what they're wearing or whether you recognize their name." David Chen and Amanda Torres exchanged knowing looks from their positions in the cabin. This was turning into the kind of moment that would be shared in flight crew stories for years to come, not because of the celebrity involved, but because of the lesson being taught. "You see," The Rock continued, his voice carrying easily over the sound of the engines beginning to power up, "I've been on both sides of this equation. I've had $7 in my pocket and nowhere to go. I've also been fortunate enough to achieve success beyond my wildest dreams. Want to know what I learned?" Sterling nodded mutely, his earlier swagger replaced by genuine attention. Around them, other first-class passengers had given up any pretense of not listening. "The true measure of success isn't in how people treat you when they know who you are. It's in how you treat people before they know who you are." The Rock's words settled over the cabin like a gentle but undeniable truth. As the plane began its takeoff roll, Lisa Reynolds distributed the required safety reminder cards, pausing briefly at row 2 to witness what had become an impromptu masterclass in humility and leadership. "You mentioned earlier that you're a CEO," The Rock continued once they were airborne. "That's impressive. It takes hard work to reach that level. But leadership isn't just about achieving success, it's about how you carry that success." Sterling looked down at his Rolex, seeing it now not as a symbol of status, but as a reminder of how he'd lost sight of what truly mattered. "I've become so focused on protecting my position," he admitted quietly, "on making sure everyone knows my worth, that I forgot about basic human dignity." "That's actually a brave thing to acknowledge," The Rock responded, his tone encouraging rather than condemning. "You know, in wrestling, we had a saying, it's not about how many times you get knocked down, it's about how many times you get back up. The same is true in life." From his seat, Bradley Thompson watched as Sterling's posture gradually changed from defensive to receptive. As a veteran, he recognized the transformation taking place, the stripping away of artificial armor to reveal the potential for genuine strength. Young Peter's voice piped up from a few rows back. "Mr. Rock, sir, can I tell you something?" The entire cabin turned to look at the boy, who had finally been unable to contain himself any longer. The Rock's face lit up with his famous smile. "Of course, buddy. What's on your mind?" "I think you're amazing, not because you're famous, but because you're kind. My mom says that's what real strength is." The cabin fell silent as the profound wisdom of the child's words sank in. Catherine Walsh beamed with pride at her son's observation, while Sterling seemed to shrink further into his seat as the truth of the statement hit home. "Your mom is a very wise woman," The Rock responded, giving both Peter and Catherine a warm smile. "And you know what? That's exactly what we're talking about here. Real strength, real success, real class. It's all about how we treat others." Lisa Reynolds, who had been about to begin the drink service, paused to let the moment continue uninterrupted. In her 20 years of flying, she had never witnessed such a powerful demonstration of grace under pressure. "Mr. Sterling," The Rock turned back to his seatmate, "earlier you talked about your company's valuation, your homes, your car collection. Those are impressive achievements. But let me share something I've learned. At the end of the day, people won't remember what you owned. They'll remember how you made them feel." Sterling nodded slowly, his expensive suit no longer seeming like armor, but instead feeling more like a costume he'd hidden behind. "I've spent so much time building my image," he admitted, "that I forgot about building my character." "Now that," The Rock smiled, "is the kind of revelation that can change a life. You know what the beautiful thing is? Every interaction is a chance to start fresh, to be better, to show real class. As if to demonstrate this point, the Rock turned to address the entire first-class cabin. Actually, since we're all here together for the next few hours, why don't we make this a positive experience? I'd love to hear everyone's stories. Sometimes the best lessons come from simply listening to each other. The atmosphere in the cabin transformed instantly. The tension that had built during Sterling's earlier behavior dissipated, replaced by a sense of community that transcended the usual barriers of first-class travel. As the plane cruised at altitude, something remarkable began to unfold in that first-class cabin. A tech CEO's moment of humbling was becoming a lesson in humanity that none of the passengers would ever forget. And at the center of it all was a man who, despite having every reason to respond to disrespect with anger, chose instead to transform it into an opportunity for growth. The story of what happened next would soon spread far beyond Flight A2471. But the real impact wasn't in the telling. It was in the change it inspired in everyone who witnessed it, especially in a certain tech CEO who was learning that true class has nothing to do with the price of your ticket. As Flight AA2471 continued its journey across the country, the first-class cabin had transformed into something rarely seen at 30,000 feet, a genuine community. The initial tension of Marcus Sterling's confrontation with the Rock had evolved into a powerful lesson about humility, respect, and the true meaning of success. The Rock, having turned what could have been an uncomfortable situation into a teaching moment, was now engaging with other passengers in a way that demonstrated exactly why he was known as the people's champion. He had somehow managed to make everyone in the cabin feel equally valued, from young Peter Walsh to Bradley Thompson, the retired veteran. You know what's interesting about success? The Rock addressed the cabin, his voice carrying that unique blend of authority and warmth. It's a lot like this airplane. It can take you to amazing places, but without the right guidance system, without humility and gratitude, you can easily lose your way. Marcus Sterling, who had spent the last hour in quiet reflection, finally found his voice again. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier," he said, his tone completely transformed from his initial arrogance. "About how we treat people before we know who they are. I've built my entire career on being recognized, on making sure everyone knows my status. But today, I'm the one who failed to recognize true greatness, not just in you, but in the basic dignity of every person." Lisa Reynolds, who had witnessed countless dramas unfold in first class over her career, watched as something remarkable happened. The tech CEO who had started the flight believing himself above others was now engaged in genuine self-reflection. "Mr. Johnson," Sterling continued, "I need to apologize not just for my behavior toward you, but for the attitude it represented. I've been teaching the wrong lessons to my employees, my children, everyone around me." The Rock nodded thoughtfully. "You know what takes real strength? Admitting when we're wrong and being willing to change. That's something I learned in the wrestling ring, in Hollywood, and in life. It's not about never making mistakes. It's about how we handle them when we do." Young Peter, who had been listening intently, raised his hand as if he were in school. "Mr. Rock, sir? Is that why you're always so nice to everyone, even when they're not nice to you?" The cabin fell silent, waiting for the Rock's response. His smile was genuine as he addressed not just Peter, but everyone listening. "That's exactly right, buddy, because you never know what someone else is going through. Sometimes the person who seems the most arrogant is actually the most insecure. Real strength is being kind, especially when it's hard." Bradley Thompson leaned forward in his seat. "In the military, we had a saying, 'True leadership is earned, not declared.' Watching this situation unfold today, I've seen a perfect example of that principle in action." Captain Richard Anderson's voice came over the intercom, announcing their initial descent into New York. But the lesson being taught in first class wasn't finished yet. "Mr. Sterling," The Rock turned to his seatmate, "earlier you talked about your company's success. Tell me, What's your relationship like with your employees? Sterling's face flushed slightly. I honestly don't know many of them personally. I've always maintained what I thought was a necessary distance to command respect. Would you be open to a suggestion? The Rock asked, his tone encouraging rather than judgmental. When Sterling nodded, he continued, What if you took the energy you've been putting into maintaining your image and invested it in getting to know your people instead? Real leadership isn't about being seen, it's about seeing others. David Chen and Amanda Torres, the flight attendants who had witnessed the entire encounter, exchanged meaningful looks. They had served countless executives and celebrities, but rarely had they seen such a powerful demonstration of humble leadership. As the plane began its descent into New York, Sterling pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly. I'm sending an email to my executive team, he explained. We're going to start making some changes, beginning with how we treat every person in our organization, regardless of their position. The Rock smiled. Now that's what I call using your platform for positive change. You know, in every movie I've made, every wrestling match I've fought, the most important people weren't always the ones in the spotlight. They were the crew members, the staff, the people behind the scenes who made everything possible. Catherine Walsh, Peter's mother, spoke up from her seat. My son will remember this flight for the rest of his life. Not because he met a celebrity, but because he witnessed a lesson about character that no classroom could teach. As the New York skyline came into view through the windows, Lisa Reynolds began preparing the cabin for landing. She noticed how different the atmosphere was now compared to takeoff. The artificial barriers that usually separated first-class passengers had dissolved, replaced by a sense of shared experience and understanding. Before we land, the Rock addressed Sterling one final time. I want you to know something. The fact that you're willing to acknowledge your mistakes and commit to change, that shows more strength than any designer suit or expensive watch ever could. Sterling looked down at his Rolex, then slowly began to remove it. My father gave me this watch when I made my first million, he said quietly. He told me it would make people respect me. I never questioned whether that was the right way to earn respect. The good news is, The Rock responded, it's never too late to redefine what success means to you. Sometimes our greatest moments of growth come from our most humbling experiences. As the plane touched down at JFK International Airport, the lesson that had begun with an act of arrogance had transformed into something profound. The first-class cabin had become a classroom for one of life's most important lessons. That true class has nothing to do with status, wealth, or position, and everything to do with how we treat others. The passengers began gathering their belongings, but no one seemed in a hurry to leave. They had all become part of something special, witnesses to a moment of transformation that would stay with them long after they left the aircraft. Mr. Johnson, Sterling said as they prepared to disembark, thank you for not just putting me in my place when you could have. Thank you for showing me a better way. The Rock's response was characteristic of his philosophy. Sometimes the best way to show our strength is by lifting others up, even when they start by trying to push us down. As the passengers finally began to leave the aircraft, young Peter rushed up to The Rock with one final question. Mr. Rock, can I tell my friends at school what I learned today? Absolutely, buddy, The Rock smiled. Tell them that real success isn't about how high you climb. It's about how many people you lift up along the way. Lisa Reynolds watched as the passengers departed, knowing she had witnessed something extraordinary. This wasn't just another celebrity encounter story. It was a powerful reminder that true character reveals itself not in moments of triumph, but in how we handle ourselves when faced with disrespect and prejudice. The story of Flight AA2471 would soon spread across social media, not because of the celebrity involved, but because of the lesson it taught. It would remind people everywhere that sometimes our greatest teachings come from our most humbling moments, and that true class isn't about what you wear or where you sit. It's about how you treat others, especially when you think no one of consequence is watching. If you've ever experienced a moment of humbling that led to growth, share your story in the comments below. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from our most challenging moments, and your story might just help someone else learn from their own.